October 1942. The rain had not stopped for 3 days at Chelston Airfield, England. The ground was soft with mud, the sky low and gray, and inside the surgical tent a different kind of storm was unfolding. Colonel Malcolm Grow bent over the operating table, his hands deep inside the torn chest of a young navigator, the smell of antiseptic mixed with blood and aviation fuel. Outside, the engines of another B-17 rumbled coughing after the long return from Germany. Inside, the war had already entered the body. He moved quietly with the precision of a man who no longer needed to think. Forceps, gauze, another fragment. The metal shard clinked into a tray, small, almost delicate like the petal of a steel flower. It had torn through leather, wool, flesh, and lung before losing its strength. But the man on the table was still breathing. Barely. Grow had seen it too many times. These wounds had a strange familiarity, the jagged edges, the shallow depth, the slow bleeding. They were not the clean holes of machine gun bullets. They were something else. Fragments. Low velocity. Random. Everywhere. He paused, his eyes meeting the faces of the nurses around him. They looked young, exhausted, and quietly frightened. There was never enough morphine, never enough blood, never enough sleep. But there was always another stretcher, always another body. Outside, the airfield trembled as more ambulances arrived. The wounded were lined up on the wet grass waiting, some still conscious, some whispering prayers. Nearly 70% of them had the same kind of injury, steel fragments from exploding flak shells. The same pattern again and again. That night, after the last operation, Grow sat alone in the corner of the tent. His hands still trembled slightly. He stared at the tray of fragments he had pulled from human bodies that day. Each one had once been part of something else. A shell casing, a bomber wing, a piece of home turned into a weapon. He began to count them, not out of obsession, but out of anger. There were too many. In his notebook, he began to write. If there were something between the skin and the sky, he thought something that could catch these fragments before they reached the body. He stopped. It sounded foolish. Armor for airmen. No one would approve that. The Air Force didn't even have such a program. But he couldn't unsee the pattern. Grow was not a weapons engineer. He was a surgeon trained to repair, not invent. But surgeons understand something soldiers often forget: wounds that tell stories. They reveal the truth no report can hide. And the truth was simple. These wounds were preventable. A few weeks later, an official report confirmed what he already knew. The majority of bomber casualties were caused not by fighter gunfire, but by low-velocity fragments from flak and from the bombers themselves. The numbers were cold, but they spoke loudly. 36% of deaths came from chest wounds, 39% from abdominal wounds, 75% of fatal injuries struck the torso. Protect the torso, and you protect the man. But protection was not part of the plan. The Air Force saw no point in body armor. Armor belonged to knights, not airmen. It was too heavy, too clumsy. It would interfere with parachutes and oxygen lines. When Grow submitted his proposal, simple sketch of overlapping steel plates sewn into cloth, the response was silence. Then rejection. Impractical, they said, too heavy, too expensive. And the crews won't wear it anyway. He could have stopped there, but he didn't. In war, some people fight with guns. Others fight with persistence. Grow was one of the latter. He gathered more data, more diagrams, more evidence. He wrote letters, requested meetings, spoke to anyone who would listen. He argued that bomber crews were not infantry. They didn't need to run or crawl. They needed to survive. The fragments that tore through them were slow enough to be stopped by thin steel. Still, his request was buried under paperwork. The military machine moved slower than shrapnel. So he decided to go around it. In October 1942, Grow contacted the British. The Royal Air Force had experimented with body armor but failed. Their planes were too cramped, their designs too heavy. But Grow saw a difference. American bombers had slightly more room enough to make it work. The British connected him with a company older than America itself, the Wilkinson Sword Company, a firm that had once forged blades for kings, now making razors and aircraft parts. It was an unlikely partnership, a surgeon and a sword maker, but they spoke the same language, the language of steel. Grow arrived at Wilkinson's factory with his sketches and a small box of flak fragments. He poured them onto the table. "This," he said, "is what is killing them. Can you stop this?" The engineers examined the fragments. They were small, twisted and dull-edged. After a few seconds of silence, one of them said softly, "Yes, I think we can." They began experimenting with thin plates of manganese steel 2 inches wide, 1 millimeter thick. Small enough to be flexible, hard enough to deflect a fragment. They stitched the plates into canvas like scales on a dragon. When they tested it with shrapnel, the plates held. The fragments stopped. By December, the first prototypes were ready. Heavy but wearable. Awkward but protective. Grow called them flak vests. Headquarters called them unauthorized. He didn't care. He began issuing them quietly to bomber crews in his sector. No memos, no approvals, just steel and faith. When the next group of wounded arrived, something changed. A gunner limped into the tent wearing one of the vests. His abdomen was bruised black, the fabric torn, but the steel plates beneath were intact. Lodged in one of them was a fragment, flattened harmless. Without that vest, it would have been his heart. Grow held the plate in his hand and felt its weight. For the first time in months, he smiled. Word spread through the airfields. Crews began asking for the Grow armor. Mechanics welded extra plates. Nurses stitched canvas covers. Commanders looked the other way. It was still unauthorized, but it was saving lives. What began as one man's defiance was slowly becoming a movement, quiet, improvised, unstoppable. By spring 1943, the data spoke again. Wound rates among armored crews dropped by more than half. Fatal torso wounds fell by over 70%. For every 10 men who once died, 7 now came home. And all because one surgeon refused to accept that death was inevitable. He wasn't allowed to do it, but he did it anyway, and it saved 7,000 lives. The first time the vest was tested in combat, it happened by accident. A B-17 crew from the 303rd Bomb Group had been among those quietly equipped with Grow's experimental armor. On a mission over northern France, their aircraft was hit by a wall of flak. The sky erupted in black puffs, each detonation sending hundreds of steel splinters spinning through the air. One of those fragments punched through the fuselage and struck the bombardier square in the chest. He fell back certain he was dead. But when the crew reached him, he was breathing. The fragment had stopped buried halfway into the small steel square hidden under his jacket. The vest had taken the blow. When they landed, the medical team gathered around the vest, staring at the flattened shard that would have pierced his heart. Grow was there too. He didn't speak. He just looked at the piece of steel and exhaled. For the first time, the proof wasn't on paper. It was alive. But word of his unauthorized equipment spread just as fast as the story of survival. Headquarters summoned him to explain himself. The tone was official, but under the surface it was irritation. Why was a medical officer running his own weapons program? Grow arrived at the meeting wearing his uniform pressed, but his expression calm. Across the table sat officers more concerned with regulations than statistics. They asked if he understood the implications of manufacturing unapproved gear in wartime. "Yes, sir," he said. "I understand that without it we are losing men we don't need to lose." One colonel frowned. "You're a doctor, not an engineer." Grow nodded. "Exactly. And doctors are trained to stop bleeding. That's all I'm trying to do." The room fell silent. There was no rule book for this kind of defiance. The headquarters couldn't admit he was right without admitting they had overlooked the problem. So they compromised. He would be allowed to continue unofficially. The project could go on as long as it didn't slow operations or drain resources. It was permission without acknowledgement. But to grow, that was enough. Back in England, he worked with the Wilkinson Sword engineers to refine the design. The original vest weighed 22 pounds, too heavy for long missions. They began cutting down plate size, rearranging the pattern to reduce gaps while improving flexibility. The steel squares were stitched like scales overlapping by just enough to deflect fragments without stiffening the torso. Each improvement came from observation, not theory. Every damaged vest returned from a mission told them what worked and what didn't. Each embedded fragment was a clue. Some plates bent, some cracked, some stopped everything. Grow collected them like evidence in a trial. Every piece spoke for someone who had survived. Soon, crews began to trust the armor as much as their parachutes. Before takeoff, some men would tap the steel plates twice, a quiet ritual for luck. Others joked that they felt half knight, half tin can. But beneath the humor was gratitude. The war had become personal. In February 1943, the statistics became undeniable. Out of all recorded casualties, those wearing Grow's vest had 60% fewer fatal injuries. The medical officers noted the pattern, and reports began moving up the chain. What had started as a rogue experiment was turning into a revolution in crew survival. Still, there were doubters. Some commanders believed morale was the only reason the vest seemed effective, that men fought better when they felt protected. Others argued that added weight made the crews less efficient, increasing fuel consumption. Grow countered with math. "Fuel is cheaper than life," he said quietly. By March, Wilkinson's Sword could no longer meet demand. Their small production lines, already stretched with war contracts, could produce only 100 vests a month. Meanwhile, the 8th Air Force needed thousands. Grow began searching for help across the Atlantic. He wrote to contacts in Washington arguing that American manufacturers could scale production. His proposal reached the War Department, where it finally found sympathy. Not because of orders, but because of proof hundreds of men returning alive with fragments lodged in their vests. The United States soon approved domestic production, but with one condition: design oversight would come from a most unusual source, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. It sounded absurd, a museum crafting body armor for war. But the museum's Arms and Armor Department held centuries of knowledge about how steel could move with the body. Curators and craftsmen who once restored medieval suits of plate now studied how to save modern airmen. When Grow heard the news, he smiled. "Then it's fitting," he said. "The old armor will protect the new soldiers." In the months that followed, prototypes traveled back and forth between London and New York. The museum experts redesigned the plates into precise configurations, balancing coverage and weight. They called the final version the M1 flak vest. The steel was the same manganese alloy Wilkinson had perfected, but the arrangement was more efficient. The new vest weighed only 17 pounds. It was lighter, stronger, and easier to wear. Production began in summer 1943. Each vest required 126 steel plates, each sewn by hand into nylon fabric. Factories from New York to Ohio joined the effort. Within months, thousands of vests were shipped to England. And for the first time, the 8th Air Force issued an order official this time. Every crew member flying combat missions would be equipped with protective armor. The unauthorized project had become doctrine. By autumn, the difference was visible. Medical tents that once overflowed after every mission began to empty sooner. Fewer men arrived bleeding out from chest wounds. Surgeons like Grow could operate with a sense of hope. They no longer counted only the dead. But the sky over Europe remained merciless. The German flak batteries grew thicker, their fire more accurate. And on October 14, 1943, the mission to Schweinfurt tested everything the vest could endure. 291 bombers flew into the storm. 60 never came back. 17 more crashed on landing. 121 limped home full of holes. Yet among those who survived, the armor had performed beyond expectation. Crews displayed their vests' fragments buried deep in steel squares that had held firm. Many would later say it was the only reason they made it home. That night, Grow sat by his tent again, a familiar fatigue pressing on him. But this time, he was not alone with failure. On the table before him lay a single vest, torn, burned, but intact, a silent witness. He ran his fingers over the metal plates rough with impact scars. Each mark was a life saved. He had disobeyed. He had been told to stop. But the numbers did not lie. He had changed the mathematics of survival in the air war, and somewhere, thousands of families would never know that a man they had never met, a surgeon who refused to wait for permission, was the reason their sons, brothers, and husbands came home alive. The winter of 1943 came with smoke and exhaustion. The airfields in England were busier than ever, and the sky over Europe remained a dark theater of flak fire and faith. But inside quiet workshops, thousands of miles away, another kind of battle was being fought, one made not of gunfire but of stitching forging and the careful sound of hammers tapping steel. In New York City, snow fell outside the grand marble steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Inside, under dim yellow lamps, men in aprons stood over tables lined with steel squares. These were not blacksmiths of the medieval past, nor artists restoring relics. They were armorers, once again men who had studied history's forgotten protection, now using it to save the living. The museum's arms and armor department had become something no one had imagined before a design bureau for war. Its director-curator, Stephen Grancy, knew every curve of a 15th-century brigandine, every seam of a Renaissance cuirass. For years, he had preserved the weapons of the dead. Now he was helping the living endure the modern battlefield. When Colonel Malcolm Grow's proposal and British prototypes arrived, Grancy and his team began their work like surgeons of steel. They laid out one of the old brigandines from the museum's collection, small metal plates overlapping under layers of cloth and leather, and compared it to Wilkinson Sword's flak vest. The resemblance was uncanny. The past had already invented what the present desperately needed. It only required translation. The challenge was balance. The vest had to stop a fragment traveling hundreds of feet per second, but it also had to move with the man wearing it. It had to cover the chest, abdomen, and sides while allowing the bomber crews to twist, reach, and breathe. A single mistake in the pattern could mean a fatal gap. Grancy wrote in his notes, "The design of Armor Vest M6, which is the latest standardized flyer's armor, is based on one of the museum's brigandines, dating from about 1400. In the same halls where knights' armor once stood as silent witnesses of another age, the curators now drew blueprints for a war fought 10,000 feet above the clouds. The new American design used nylon fabric instead of heavy canvas, stronger, lighter, more resistant to moisture. The plates were still made of manganese steel, each 2 inches, square 1 millimeter thick. But now they were arranged with greater precision, following lines of force across the human body. Each vest required over 100 plates, each one sewn by hand into small pockets. The craftsmen followed patterns traced directly from medical data. Where men had been wounded, they added protection. Where movement mattered most, they reduced weight. Factories in New York, Massachusetts, and Ohio began to hum with a new rhythm. Sewing machines joined the symphony of wartime production. Women who had once stitched coats now stitched armor. Men who had once built automobile parts now cut steel for vests. The vest was designated officially as the M1 Flyer's armor, and for the first time it carried the full approval of the U.S. Army Air Forces. It was no longer unauthorized. It was essential. By October 5, 1943, the order came down from 8th Air Force headquarters in England. Every combat crew member would be issued armor appropriate to their position. Pilots and co-pilots received modified versions with less back coverage since their seats were armored from below. Waist gunners wore aprons to protect their lower bodies. Ball turret gunners trapped in the tiny glass sphere beneath the plane received custom sections shaped to fit their unique prison of steel. The adoption was immediate. What had once been a quiet rebellion became regulation. Grow walked through one of the airfields on a cold morning that same month. Rows of bombers waited for takeoff, their silver skins glinting under the pale sun. Crewmen moved about, checking flaps, loading bombs, adjusting guns. Among them, he noticed something new. Beneath their jackets, the faint outline of the armor's square plates caught the light. The sound of the vests brushing against fabric made a muted rustle the sound of survival. One of the waist gunners saw him and smiled. "Doc, these things are heavy," he said, "but I'll take heavy over dead any day." Grow nodded. That's the right kind of weight to carry. By early 1944, medical statistics told the rest of the story. The fatal chest wounds that once killed a third of wounded crewmen had dropped to less than 10%. Abdominal deaths fell by more than 80%. The number of men wounded at all was down by half. The math no longer screamed despair. It whispered hope. But Grow's work did not stop at steel. He had come to understand that saving lives in the air meant protecting both the body and the mind. The high altitudes froze men, the stress shattered them. He worked on electrically heated flight suits and gloves on oxygen systems that prevented blackout on rest homes for exhausted crews. He introduced psychiatric screenings to help those haunted by the missions. To Grow, the human machine was not made of one part. It was a system, physical, mental, emotional, that had to be maintained with care. The results transformed the Air Force. Morale improved. Missions ran smoother. And for the first time since the bombing campaign began, crews began to believe they could finish their tours and go home. In April 1944, the new M3 helmet developed under Grow's direction joined the armor set. Its overlapping manganese strips provided far better protection than the old infantry design. Gunners especially loved it. It stopped fragments that once tore through their faces and skulls. Together, the helmet and the vest became symbols of a quiet revolution, not of aggression, but of defense. The contrast was striking. In an age defined by destruction, one man had built something to preserve life. When General Arnold, the commander of the U.S. Army Air Forces, visited the bases in England that summer, he asked to meet the man behind the armor. Grow stood at attention, modest, his uniform still stained faintly from the field hospital. Arnold looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "You weren't supposed to do this," he said. Grow smiled faintly. "No, sir. But they weren't supposed to die this easily either." The general didn't reply. He simply extended his hand. That handshake was the quiet moment of recognition that had been 2 years in the making. By then, tens of thousands of vests had been produced. American factories had shipped armor faster than bombs. The same nation that once doubted a surgeon's defiance now depended on it. Each vest carried a small label sewn inside a production mark, a number, and sometimes a note. One seamstress had written on the fabric lining of a vest bound for Europe, "Come home safe." No one knew if the man who wore it ever did. But the hope was stitched into the seams just as real as the steel within. By the summer of 1944, on the eve of D-Day, nearly every American bomber over France flew with armored crews. The vest had done its work. It didn't make them invincible. It didn't stop fear, but it changed the odds. And sometimes that is all that stands between death and return. That autumn, Malcolm Grow was promoted to brigadier general and awarded the Legion of Merit. The citation mentioned his outstanding initiative and determination in developing light body armor, which saved many lives and improved morale. But in his own mind, the true award was quieter the sound of fewer stretchers arriving at his tent. The war still raged, and countless battles remained to be fought. But the surgeon, who wasn't allowed to act, had already proved that permission was not a prerequisite for compassion. In the years to come, others would perfect what he had begun. Kevlar, ceramic plates, composite fibers, all of them descendants of those first stitched squares of manganese steel. But in every layer of armor worn by soldiers or police officers today, there remains a trace of that same question. Grow once asked in a dark field tent in 1942, "What if we could put something between the skin and the sky?" That question, and the man who asked it, had saved thousands. The morning of October 14, 1943 began like so many others, gray, wet, and cold. Yet in the airfields scattered across England there was something different in the silence before takeoff. The crews of the 8th Air Force were preparing for a mission that would later be called Black Thursday. They did not know it yet, but this day would measure the limits of courage, steel, and survival itself. At 6 a.m., fog hung low over the runways as ground crews moved like shadows beneath the massive wings of 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses. Mechanics checked the bomb racks, refueled engines, tightened bolts that would soon shake under the strain of combat. The target was Schweinfurt, Germany, the heart of the Reich's ball-bearing industry. Without those bearings, tanks and aircraft would seize. But the price of hitting Schweinfurt was already known. Flak and fighters. Grow had heard the briefings too. He stood at the edge of the runway, his coat flapping in the cold wind, watching the formation climb into the dull morning sky. He knew that before sundown some of those men would return in silence or not at all. Each time he watched them leave, it felt like a roll of the dice against death itself. But now at least he knew they weren't entirely defenseless. Beneath every jacket, under every harness, hundreds of airmen carried the armor he had fought to make real. Hours later, over Germany, the sky turned into fire. The first flak bursts appeared like black flowers blooming in the thin blue air. The bombers flew straight into them, engines roaring at full power. Inside each plane, the crew could hear the fragments rattling like hail against the fuselage. Some pieces tore through aluminum, others pinged off the steel plates pressed against human ribs. A waist gunner named Carter would later recall, "It felt like someone shaking a can full of rocks around you. You could hear it everywhere in the walls and the floor in your body." One fragment struck the side of his vest, bending the small steel square inward. It left a bruise that would fade in a week. Without it, he would have bled out in minutes. By noon, Schweinfurt was below them. German 88mm guns filled the air with clouds of shrapnel. The bombers dropped their loads, and for a brief moment the earth below disappeared in smoke. Then came the turn home. That was when the fighters found them. Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulfs dove from above, streaks of silver and gray slicing through the sky. Gunners fired back tracers crossing like red threads. The air vibrated with explosions and metal screams. Grow wasn't there, but he felt every shot in his mind. Each sound, each burst of flak, each wounded man was a number in a pattern he had come to know too well. By dusk, 60 bombers were gone. 17 more were damaged beyond repair. 121 limped back, riddled with holes. More than 600 airmen were missing or dead. The mission was a tactical success, but a human catastrophe. And yet, when the survivors staggered into the field hospitals, something was different. Many were hurt, yes, but they were alive. The doctors began cutting away flight jackets, peeling off layers of wool and leather, and beneath them they found steel. Bent plates, dented squares, embedded fragments. The armor had done what it was built to do. One medical report described it simply, "The number of fatal torso wounds was far below expectation." Grow read the report that night, his hands still trembling. The vests, now blackened with soot and blood, were lined up on a table beside the operating tent. He picked one up. It was heavy, but it felt lighter than the losses he had known before. He remembered his first day in that same tent a year earlier, the hopeless repetition of chest wounds, the endless arithmetic of pain. Now, at last, the numbers were changing. The mathematics of war were cruel, but they could be rewritten. Soon after Black Thursday, Allied Command began rethinking everything. The losses were unsustainable. The 8th Air Force was bleeding faster than replacements could arrive. But Grough's armor had proved that survival was not hopeless. His data reached beyond medicine now. It became part of strategy. Protecting men was no longer a luxury. It was logistics. Yet even armor had its limits. Against flak it worked. Against bullets it helped. But against the endless reach of enemy fighters it was not enough. The bombers needed something more. Eyes, wings, and guns that could follow them all the way to the target and back. That answer arrived in early 1944, shaped like a sleek silver spear, the P-51 Mustang. Its long-range fuel tanks allowed it to escort bombers deep into Germany. For the first time, the flying fortresses would not fly alone. When Grough saw the first P-51s taxiing across the airfield, he understood what was coming. The war in the air was shifting. The armor protected the body. The Mustang protected the sky. Together, they changed the rhythm of death itself. By spring, the results were undeniable. Mission losses dropped. Survival rates soared. The same crews that once counted days now counted completions. For the first time, finishing 25 missions, the magic number for going home seemed possible. Crews began painting the edges of their armor plates with names, inscriptions, even small prayers. One vest found after a mission had 3 words scrawled inside in pencil: "Tell my mom, thank him." Grough never met the man who wrote it, but he kept the vest in his office until the war ended. In May 1944, General Henry Arnold called Grough to Washington. He handed him a medal, the Distinguished Service Medal, and said, "You changed how we fight Malcolm. You gave us back our men." Grough accepted it quietly. He wasn't thinking about medals. He was thinking about the thousands of faces he'd seen in hospital tents, those who made it home and those who didn't. When he returned to England, he visited a base hospital one last time. Rows of beds stretched out under white sheets. Some men slept, some smiled, some stared at the ceiling with the hollow look of those who had seen too much. He walked among them, speaking softly. When he reached the end of the room, a young gunner looked up and whispered, "Doc, they say that vest was your idea." Grough hesitated. "No," he said, "the idea belonged to the wounds. I just listened." The war moved on, as wars always do, devouring days and men until there were no more missions left to fly. But something had changed permanently. The skies were still deadly, but not hopeless. The statistics that once predicted certain death now offered a chance, a thin, precious line between the living and the lost. That line had been drawn not by generals, not by engineers, but by a surgeon who refused to wait for permission. And when the war finally ended, the men who came home carried 2 things with them: the memory of the sky, and the knowledge that sometimes salvation begins with a single act of defiance. The war ended not with celebration, but with exhaustion. In the summer of 1945, the airfields across England fell silent. The runways that once trembled under the thunder of engines now grew weeds through their cracks. The hangars smelled of oil dust and memory. Rows of bombers sat idle under a pale sky, their missions finished, their crews gone home or buried abroad. For the survivors, returning home was not simple. The sound of flak stayed in their dreams, the echo of engines followed them into sleep. But for many, there was one quiet comfort: they had lived. Thousands of them owed that chance to a man most would never meet, a surgeon who had looked at their wounds and refused to accept them as fate. Colonel Malcolm Grough. Now, General Grough returned to the United States in 1945. His hair was grayer, his posture slower, but his eyes still carried that same steady focus, the look of someone who had seen patterns inside chaos. In Washington, he was appointed acting air surgeon of the Army Air Forces, and 1 year later, he became the first Surgeon General of the newly independent U.S. Air Force. Yet even in his new office, surrounded by polished desks and official seals, he never forgot the tent. The smell of blood and antiseptic, the mud underfoot, the fragments that once filled his pockets, those memories followed him. They were not ghosts. They were reminders. His work did not stop with steel vests. He turned his attention to the invisible wounds of war, the fatigue, the frostbite, the mental collapse that destroyed men long before bullets did. He introduced rest homes for combat-stressed air crews, new oxygen systems that reduced blackouts at high altitudes, electrically heated suits, gloves and boots that saved countless limbs from freezing in the stratosphere. He even developed insulated casualty bags to keep the wounded alive during long flights home. Each invention carried the same spirit as that first act of defiance, simple, practical, born from the belief that death should never be accepted as inevitable. By 1949, when he retired as a major general, Grow had already changed the face of military medicine. But he rarely spoke of his own achievements. When journalists asked about the flak vest, he would smile politely and say, "It wasn't my idea. It was the data's idea. I just listened." The world, meanwhile, moved into another era of war. In Korea, American soldiers faced new dangers, rifle fire grenades and artillery. But their vests were no longer made of steel. Scientists, inspired by Grow's design, replaced metal with layers of ballistic nylon. The result was the M1952 flak jacket, lighter and more flexible, capable of stopping shrapnel, just as his original steel plates had done. Then came Vietnam. By then, nylon had evolved into new materials, Kevlar, ceramic composites, and woven fibers that could catch bullets mid-flight. But the idea, the logic, the very heartbeat of body armor remained unchanged: identify the threat, design protection for that threat, balance weight against survival, and trust the evidence over assumptions. Every modern soldier who straps on a vest today, every police officer who walks into danger wearing ballistic armor, carries a piece of that lineage. The shape has changed, the materials have changed, but the principle has not. Between skin and death, there is now something that listens to Grow's question from 1942. What if we could stop it before it enters the body? The legacy did not stay confined to the battlefield. In the 1950s and 60s, hospitals began using similar overlapping protective designs for surgeons and radiologists, shielding them from X-rays. Engineers applied the concept to astronaut suits and nuclear technicians. Even modern athletes, motorcyclists, hockey goalies, racing drivers wear armor inspired by the same overlapping plate principle, first sewn into canvas by Wilkinson's sword and perfected by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. When the Cold War spread fear across the planet, the image of a man in body armor became not just military, it became human. Protection had become part of identity, a symbol of the fragile line between courage and survival. And yet, for all the technology, Grow's greatest contribution was not physical armor. It was moral armor, the belief that compassion and intellect are not separate from war, but the only way to survive it. He once wrote in a private letter to a colleague, "We cannot cure war, but we can cure indifference." Those few words captured the essence of his life. He did not fight for glory or medals or recognition. He fought against resignation, the quiet surrender to the idea that suffering is unavoidable. In 1960, Malcolm Grow passed away at the age of 72. The Air Force named a medical center in his honor at Andrews Air Force Base, the Malcolm Grow Medical Center. Its motto still echoes his philosophy: protect the human weapon first. In the decades that followed, exhibits appeared in the very museum that had once designed his armor. Inside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a 15th-century brigandine was displayed beside a World War II flak vest. Between them, a small plaque read, "From knights to airmen, the principle endures." Visitors stared at the two armors, one ancient, one modern, realizing that the distance between them was not as wide as history suggests. The Wilkinson Sword Company, after returning to peacetime production, resumed making razors and garden tools. Yet, in its company archives, a single photo from 1943 still hangs: a group of engineers standing beside a U.S. Army officer, smiling faintly, holding a vest made of overlapping steel squares. Below it, a caption reads, "We helped him stop death for a while." Perhaps that is all any human invention can truly do: delay the inevitable, create enough time for another heartbeat, another chance, another return home. The mathematics of aerial warfare that once condemned so many had been rewritten, not by generals, but by observation, empathy, and persistence. And somewhere above the clouds in the roaring wind of history, the echo of Grove's defiance still lingers. It whispers through every pilot who straps on armor, every medic who refuses to give up, every mind that looks at tragedy and asks, what if there's another way he wasn't allowed to do it? But he did it anyway, and because of that, 7,000 men came home. 2 decades after the war, the noise of bombers had faded into the hum of jet engines and the whisper of memory. Yet in hospitals, laboratories, and classrooms across America, Colonel Malcolm Grove's question continued to echo. What if we could stop it before it enters the body? The men who had once worn his armor were older now. Some had gone on to teach others to farm, others to spend quiet lives with families who never knew how close they had come to loss. In small towns and veterans' reunions, they spoke of flak of frozen skies, of the sound of steel striking steel. And sometimes they spoke of the vest, the one thing that stood between them and the sky. One former waist gunner named Ellis would later say, it wasn't just armor. It was hope you could touch. He remembered the weight on his shoulders, the faint clink of metal squares as he climbed into the bomber. It reminded him that someone, somewhere, cared enough to think about him before he flew. That was the quiet miracle of Grove's work. It was not only the mathematics of survival he changed, it was the psychology of endurance. In every man who strapped on that vest, there was a small shift inside. The fear did not vanish, but it became manageable. The armor did not make them invincible, but it reminded them that they mattered. In the years that followed, military medicine adopted this principle as doctrine that morale and survival are intertwined. Grove's methods, his rest homes for the mentally fatigued, his emphasis on warmth. Oxygen and recovery became the blueprint for how the modern Air Force cared for its people. When space exploration began, NASA engineers studied the same designs used in Grove's vests. The flexible layers of protective fabric inspired the first suits for high-altitude pilots, and later the outer shells of astronaut gear. Between the human body and the void, they built layers of fabric, metal, and polymer that echoed the same philosophy: protect without restricting, shield without suffocating. The distance from the flak-filled skies of 1943 to the silent orbit of 1969 was less than a generation. Yet the spirit of that protection had never left. In the 1970s, as the Vietnam War ended, journalists interviewed veterans from 3 different conflicts: World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. When asked what felt different, an old airman from the 8th Air Force said, "In my war, we wore fear. In theirs, they wore armor." That difference was not technology alone. It was belief, the idea that even in war, compassion can evolve faster than destruction. Historians would later note that Grove's defiance marked a turning point in how the military thought about human life. Before him, protection had been seen as optional, even wasteful. Soldiers were replaceable statistics in a machine. After him, the equation changed. Lives became assets worth preserving. The body was no longer expendable, it was the foundation of victory. It was in many ways a quiet revolution of empathy. Inside the Malcolm Grove Medical Center, a small display sits near the entrance. Behind glass, 2 vests rest side by side. One is charred and torn, the edges of its steel squares bent from impact. The other is untouched, pristine. A symbol of what might have been had no one dared to act. A simple plaque reads, "To those who protected others before protecting themselves." Visitors often stop there, surprised that something so unassuming, so plain, could have changed the course of a war. Children press their hands against the glass, tracing the outlines of the plates. Parents read the inscription aloud. Somewhere in that silence they sense the enormity of what it represents. Not glory, not violence, but the simple refusal to accept unnecessary death. Gro's story became required reading in Air Force medical schools. Students learn his methods not only as history, but as philosophy observe question act. They are taught that medicine in war is not just about healing the wounded, but about preventing the wound before it happens. That prevention is not the absence of heroism, it is its purest form. Outside the military, his legacy shaped something even deeper, the understanding that data and humanity are not enemies. Gro's strength was not that he defied orders, it was that he listened to what the evidence whispered even when authority shouted louder. That lesson outlived him. It lives in every scientist who questions the expected, every engineer who designs for safety, first every doctor who asks, "What if this could be prevented?" In the archives of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where the original brigandine still hangs beside a World War II flak vest, the curators often speak of that connection with quiet pride. They call it the return of purpose. The armor that once belonged to knights became relevant again, not for conquest, but for compassion. The museum's catalog describes it best. These two armors, separated by 5 centuries, serve the same cause to preserve the human life within. And perhaps that is what makes Gro's story eternal. It is not only about war. It is about the fragile, stubborn determination of human beings to build walls against chaos even if only 1 inch thick. Somewhere in a quiet display case lies a single steel plate from one of Gro's vests. A fragment of flak is still lodged in its center, fused there by heat and time. It is small, no larger than a coin, but it holds the memory of a moment when one man's refusal to wait for permission changed the arithmetic of death itself. Every generation since has built upon that refusal, turning it into policy principle and protection. And perhaps that is how legacies truly endure, not as monuments or medals, but as invisible shields carried by those who never knew the name of the man who made them safe. He wasn't allowed to do it, but he did it anyway. And somewhere between the skin and the sky, the world became a little harder to kill. The museum was almost empty when the old man entered. It was late afternoon, and the light through the tall windows had turned gold, spilling quietly over the exhibits. In one corner of the hall, away from the marble knights and shining swords, a small glass case caught his attention. Inside it lay something unremarkable, dull square, patched with rust, a piece of steel no larger than a man's hand. Yet next to it the label read simply, "Flak Vest Plate, 8th Air Force, 1943. The man stood there for a long time. His reflection merged with the glass so that for a moment he seemed to be looking into another century. Around him, the air was still. Behind that tiny piece of steel was the silence of 7,000 heartbeats that never stopped. He had read about it before, how one surgeon, Malcolm Gro, had broken military protocol to save the very men he was ordered only to treat. But seeing it there under glass, he understood something deeper. The plate was not just metal. It was an argument made visible, a refusal cast in iron. Outside, the city moved fast cars. Voices neon everything made of light and distraction. But inside, the old armor still whispered. If you listened closely, it spoke of everything the modern world forgets. The patience to observe, the courage to question, the will to act even when permission is denied. It is strange, he thought, how progress so often begins with disobedience. In the decades since Gro's time armor had evolved beyond imagination, police officers now wore vests made of fibers thinner than a strand of hair, yet stronger than steel. Soldiers carried ceramic plates that could stop rifle rounds. Doctors wore radiation shields built from flexible alloys. Astronauts walked in space wrapped in multi-layered suits born from the same idea of protection between the skin and the void. And yet, for all the sophistication, the heart of it remained unchanged. It was still about listening to danger, studying its shape, and designing something human enough to resist it. The tools had changed. The principle had not. In a police academy in Chicago, a young recruit once asked his instructor why they had to wear armor on routine patrols. The instructor picked up his vest, held it in the light, and said, "Because someone once looked at death and said, 'Not today.'" He didn't mention Grove's name. He didn't need to. The legacy was already living inside the habit. That is how some stories survive, not through textbooks or memorials, but through habits so ordinary that no one remembers their origins. Every time a medic puts on protective gear before entering a disaster zone, every time a journalist dons a ballistic vest in a warfield, every time a rescue worker steps into danger wearing layers of synthetic fabric, they are continuing a conversation that began in a muddy tent in 1942. It is a conversation about responsibility, about the sacred duty of intelligence in the service of empathy. Grove's genius was never in invention alone. It was in his capacity to see that compassion and calculation were not enemies, that one could use mathematics to save, not to destroy. The mathematicians of war had once counted loss as inevitable, a necessary cost. Grove taught them to count differently, to measure survival instead. When his colleagues wrote his obituary in 1960, they called him a man who listened to wounds. It was perhaps the most accurate epitaph any doctor could have. He had listened so carefully that the wounds themselves had told him how to prevent them. And that is the quiet paradox of his story. He changed the war not by fighting it, but by protecting those forced to fight. In the years that followed, his name faded into the long gray chorus of military history. His armor became a statistic, a footnote, an artifact. But every life that outlived its own battlefield is still a proof of him. The old man in the museum leaned closer to the glass. He could see faint scratches on the metal-like veins. He imagined the moment of impact, the explosion, the shard flying, the split second between existence and nothingness, and the thin plate standing in between. It was not just a relic. It was a pause in death. He whispered almost to himself, "You weren't allowed to do it, but you did it anyway." Outside, the sun was setting. The light touched the steel, and for a heartbeat it glowed like something alive. Somewhere beyond that room, soldiers were still being trained. Doctors were still studying data. Engineers were still building the next generation of protection. And somewhere, perhaps another man or woman was about to ask a forbidden question, the kind that changes everything. Because that is how progress begins. Not in orders, but in the quiet defiance of those who believe that lives are worth the risk of disobedience. Malcolm Grove did not win a battle. He won back time for 7,000 men to come home to see their children, to grow old, to stand in places like this and remember. And maybe, as the old man turned to leave, he realized that the sound of steel is not only the sound of war. Sometimes it is the sound of mercy, the soft, enduring echo of one human being choosing to protect another. Between the skin and the sky, that sound still lingers. He wasn't allowed to do it, but he did it anyway, and the world has been harder to break ever since. It was winter again 80 years after the war that was supposed to end all wars. The snow fell softly over Washington, covering the steps of the Malcolm Grove Medical Center in a thin white silence. Inside, in a small lecture hall, a young woman sat alone after class. She was a final-year medical student training to become a military surgeon. On the desk before her lay an old photograph, black and white edges yellowed with time. In the picture, a man in uniform stood beside a table filled with strange objects. Sheets of steel rolls of fabric, sketches of human torsos drawn with the care of a sculptor. The caption read, "Colonel Malcolm C. Grove, Charleston Airfield, 1943. She had just finished studying his work for her ethics module. His unauthorized project, his defiance, his data." But something about the photo held her longer than she expected. It wasn't the steel or the statistics. It was the look in his eyes, focused, calm, and unbearably human. Outside the window, the world had changed beyond recognition. Machines could perform surgery faster than hands. Artificial intelligence could detect disease before symptoms appeared. Soldiers wore armor that could stop bullets and absorb explosions. The air was filled not with bombers, but with satellites and drones. Yet, as she stared at that photo, she realized how little the essence of medicine had changed. Grow had not invented technology. He had invented responsibility. He had seen what others ignored, that every wound was a message, every pattern a question waiting to be heard. He had taken the raw chaos of war and turned it into logic not to win, but to preserve. And that, she thought, is what medicine truly is. The courage to listen before you act, the humility to learn from suffering, the defiance to protect even when permission has not yet arrived. The lecture hall was empty now. Her classmates had left their voices fading down the corridor. But she remained there, tracing the faint lines on the old photograph with her fingertips. She thought of the men in those bombers, young, cold, terrified, and of the surgeon who had looked at their broken bodies and decided that fear would no longer be a sentence. The room's lights dimmed on a timer. She gathered her things, but before leaving, she looked once more at the picture. "You weren't allowed to do it," she whispered, "but maybe that's what makes you a healer." In the hallway, the glass cases along the wall displayed modern medical innovations, biopolymer armor, carbon nanotube implants, exoskeleton braces for trauma patients. Every one of them owed a quiet debt to a decision made in 1942 under the sound of distant engines and falling flak. As she walked past the cases, the lights caught the reflection of her white coat. She saw herself layered faintly over the display, her face merging with the gleam of the armor. The thought came to her like a small realization, simple but immense. We inherit not what they built, but how they thought. And maybe she wondered that was the true purpose of remembrance. Not to glorify the past, but to extend its questions into the future. What if we could stop it before it enters the body? What if healing could begin before the wound exists? What if compassion could be measured not in sympathy, but in systems that protect the living? The snow outside thickened, muting the city's noise. Inside the medical center, the hum of equipment blended with the steady heartbeat of machines monitoring patients. Somewhere, someone was being saved by a device whose design could trace its lineage straight back to a tent in 1942. History, she realized, never truly ends. It just changes its instruments. She left the building and stepped into the snow. The air was cold, sharp, and clean. Above her, the sky was gray, the same kind of sky that once hung over Charleston Airfield. Somewhere behind those clouds, unseen and eternal, the same question still lingered. Can we protect what we love? And perhaps that is the secret that Grow left behind, not a formula, not a medal, but a mindset. That courage does not always roar. Sometimes it simply refuses to look away. The young woman walked on her footsteps soft against the snow. In the quiet distance, a siren wailed a reminder that danger-like suffering would never disappear entirely. But now, the world had armor. Not perfect, not absolute, but enough. She turned her collar up against the wind and whispered the words she had been reading all week, the words written on the memorial plaque at the entrance to the medical center. He wasn't allowed to do it, but he did it anyway, and it saved 7,000 lives. She smiled faintly, and in that moment she understood. The story was not just his anymore. It belonged to anyone who ever stood before pain and chose to act. Between the skin and the sky, the question endures. And somewhere beneath layers of time and steel and memory, the answer still beats softly alive, human, unafraid. The letter was dated August 12, 1960. The handwriting was uneven, the ink slightly faded. On the top of the page, in careful block letters, it read, "To General Malcolm C. Grow, U.S. Air Force, Washington, D.C." But by the time it arrived, the addressee was gone. Malcolm Grow had passed away just 3 weeks earlier at the age of 72. The letter sat unopened for several months before someone in the Air Force archives finally read it. It was from a man named Sergeant Thomas Avery, once a waist gunner with the 303rd Bomb Group. He had been 21 in 1943, flying through the smoke and chaos of the European Air War. Now he was nearly 40, living quietly in Ohio, running a small repair shop, married with 2 daughters who had never seen war. The letter was long handwritten in the kind of looping script that carried both age and care. It began without introduction, almost as though he were resuming a conversation that had been waiting 20 years to continue. Dear General Grow, you do not know me, sir, but I owe you my life. He wrote about the mission to Bremen in June 1943. His B-17 had taken a direct hit from flak near the waist position. The explosion blew out part of the fuselage. 2 men were killed instantly. A jagged piece of steel struck him across the stomach and knocked him backward. He remembered falling, thinking the worst had come. But when he looked down, he saw the vest. The steel squares sewn inside the canvas had caught the fragment. It had cut through the outer cloth, dented the plate, but not him. I felt the heat of it, he wrote, but I didn't feel the pain. It was like the sky had missed me by an inch. He crawled to his gun, kept firing, and lived to tell the story. He didn't know where the armor had come from or who had designed it. The crew simply called it the doctor's vest. After the war, he went home, started a family, and every now and then when thunder rolled or a car backfired too loud, he remembered the sound of flak striking steel. 20 years later, he had read in the newspaper about the man responsible, the Air Force surgeon, who had defied orders, built armor from museum blueprints, and saved thousands. And so he wrote, I just wanted to say thank you. You gave me more than years. You gave me everything that fit inside them. My daughters, my wife, my mornings. I never knew your face, but I've carried your work with me every day. When my oldest was born, I held her in my arms and thought of that sound, the one the steel made when it stopped the piece that would have taken me. I've never forgotten it. It was the sound of mercy. The letter ended simply, if this ever reaches you, sir, I hope you know that you didn't just save airmen. You saved fathers, husbands, sons, and the people who would come after them. Wherever you are now, I hope the sky is quiet. Signed, Thomas Avery Formerly, of the 303rd Bomb Group, 8th Air Force. When the archivist finished reading, he folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope marked Return to Family. But before sealing it, he read the last line again and paused. There was something universal about it, something that belonged not just to the dead, but to everyone who still lived because of what Grow had done. Years later, the letter was displayed at the Malcolm Grow Medical Center. It sat beside a photograph of a dented flak vest, the steel plate still warped from impact. Beneath it, a small card quoted Avery's words. It was the sound of mercy. Visitors who stopped to read often lingered, drawn by the handwriting, the human voice breaking through the statistics of war. They would trace the curves of the script through the glass and realize that this was not a letter from one soldier to another. It was a letter from the living to the idea of mercy itself. And perhaps that was what made Grow's story endure. Long after the bombs had fallen silent, it reminded the world that the smallest decisions can echo longer than any weapon. A single act of defiance, a quiet no spoken in the name of compassion, can ripple through generations until gratitude finds its way back to the source, even if the source is gone. Somewhere in the archives, the original letter still rests. The ink has faded almost to gray, but the last line remains legible, steady, unbroken. You weren't allowed to do it, but you did it anyway. And I'm still here. The rain was gentle that morning in Arlington. Thin drops fell on the rows of white stones that stretched endlessly across the hill, glinting under the pale gray sky. Near the edge of the cemetery, beneath a modest headstone marked Malcolm C. Grow, Major General, U.S. Air Force. A single steel fragment had been placed in the grass. It was small, no larger than a coin. No one knew who left it there. The stone said nothing of rebellion, of data, or of saving thousands. It said only his name, his rank, and his years of life. The rest of the story lived elsewhere in the beating hearts of those who never met him, in the unseen rituals of people who still believed that protection is a form of love. A few steps away, a group of young Air Force cadets stood silently in the drizzle. They had come as part of a medical history course. Their instructor spoke softly, but the rain drowned most of his words. It didn't matter. The silence said enough. When they were dismissed, one cadet lingered. He was barely 20, the same age as the men who once flew over Europe. He bent down, touched the wet grass, and whispered, "Thank you, sir." Then he stood and walked away. No one heard him, but the wind carried his voice, folding it into the mist. History, when stripped of dates and ranks, is just the story of people who cared enough to ask questions others were too afraid to ask. Malcolm Grove's question had been simple, almost naive. Why must they die this way? But simple questions can be dangerous. They demand change. They force systems built on obedience to face the mirror of conscience. He did not invent courage. He merely gave it a shape, thin sheets of steel sewn by hand, layered with faith. He did not seek glory, but he found meaning in the act of noticing. He looked at suffering not as a statistic but as a language, and in that language he heard the same plea whispered across every generation: protect us if you can. The war ended long ago, yet his question never did. It echoes in laboratories where scientists build new shields for new dangers. It hums through hospitals where doctors fight invisible wars against infection and time. It drifts through classrooms where students learn that heroism is not always loud. Sometimes it is the quiet insistence that things can be made better. In the decades that followed, the world would learn that progress is not measured in speed or firepower, but in compassion, refined by reason. Every Kevlar vest, every radiation shield, every safety harness that saves a life is a continuation of that defiance, the refusal to accept death as inevitable when understanding can prevent it. Perhaps, in some quiet sense, that is humanity's oldest battle, to stand between the chaos and the body, between the void and the heartbeat. To build a barrier, however thin, and call it mercy. The museum still displays one of Grove's vests. The steel is dull, its edges worn, its fabric frayed by decades. Yet when you stand before it, the air seems to grow still. You can almost hear the faint rattle of flak striking the plates, the distant hum of engines, the whisper of someone's prayer caught between fear and faith. And if you listen long enough, another sound rises beneath it, the pulse of gratitude still moving through time. Every life saved by protection, every moment stolen back from fate is a note in that quiet song. When the lights dim in the museum at closing hour, the vest stands alone under a single beam of soft light. No applause, no ceremony. Just the steady presence of what it represents: a man who asked the right question at the right moment and refused to look away. Outside, the city hums with life. Cars pass, sirens echo. People hurry through the rain, most unaware that their world is safer because someone once broke a rule in the name of humanity. But that is how history survives, carried not in noise but in the quiet continuation of care. He wasn't allowed to do it, but he did it anyway. And somewhere in the hush between storm and heartbeat, the world remembers.